The Senate chamber held a silence Rome had never heard before. Not the silence of attention, not the silence of scheming. This was the silence of men who had emptied every drawer of every plan and found nothing left inside. Two consular armies, the spine of the Republic, the iron that had broken Carthage and Macedonia, lay scattered across the fields of southern Italy, cut down by a Thracian slave and a column of men carrying weapons taken from the dead. The messengers had not finished their report before senators glanced toward the doors. Beneath the lamplight, beneath the marble, you could smell it. The sour sweat of men in silk who had never once in their lives been hunted. Chairs scraped, speeches died mid-breath. Out in the city, behind shuttered villas, slaves were loading carts with gold and silver while their masters watched the night for movement. Inside the chamber, the most powerful body in the known world sat frozen. No speech could fix this. No vote, no bribe, no alliance. Spartacus had stopped being a name on a warrant. Senators now said it the way farmers say the word for a flood, a force, a verdict. Into that room walked a man who did not feel fear. He felt something sharper: appetite. Marcus Licinius Crassus had built the largest private fortune in Rome using a single method that explained everything about him. When a building caught fire in the city, Crassus did not send for water. He arrived at the smoke with his own brigade, hundreds of trained slaves. And he waited. The flames climbed. The owner stood in the street watching his life crack and collapse. Then Crassus made an offer: sell now, at his price. Once the seal touched the contract, his men unrolled the hoses and went to work. He built his fortune one ruined man at a time. He did it patiently. He did it for decades. By 71 BC, he was worth an estimated 200 million sesterces, enough to finance a war out of his own purse without a glance at the ledger. And now Rome itself was the burning building. The Senate was the desperate seller. Crassus stood outside with his crew, watching the smoke, naming his price. What follows is not a story of liberation. The hunger for freedom is in it, burning real in the men who walked beside Spartacus across Italy with stolen blades and farming hooks. But this is something else. This is two predators of different species meeting on the same ground. On one side, a man who had turned his own suffering into a furnace, who had convinced 70,000 people that dying upright was better than disappearing slowly, who had broken Rome's best armies twice in open battle. On the other side, a man who had never tasted desperation, who looked at the living world and saw inventory, assets to acquire, leverage, liquidate, and who was about to apply that arithmetic to a human being with the same cold patience he had used on burning houses. One of them would die in a field south of Rome, hacked apart past recognition. The other would be robbed of his triumph by the system he bled to keep alive. Drop a comment below and tell us the city and country you're watching from. The Romanus community covers the entire map, and we want to see it. Take 1 second to subscribe if you haven't already. It costs nothing, and it keeps stories like this alive. You're watching Romanus, your home of the Roman Empire, on YouTube. The 6 legions Crassus raised in the autumn of 72 BC did not pass through the normal arteries of Roman recruitment. No magistrate stamped the enlistment rolls in the tabularium. No state quartermasters signed off on grain contracts in the Forum Holitorium. No senatorial committee debated the budget for shields under the bronze tablets of the Curia Hostilia. Crassus opened his own vaults on the Palatine and built the army the way another man builds a country house. He paid the best smiths in Italy to forge new gladi, blades with the balance and edge that veteran trainers asked for by name. The workshops of Capua and Puteoli ran day and night through the late harvest, their bellows feeding charcoal furnaces, while iron stock from the Tuscan hills was beaten into shape. He commissioned fresh lorica hamata and segmented plate, fitted to the body, proofed against thrust. The difference between a man who survives his first contact and a man who does not. He bought centurions outright, hard men, veterans who had marched under Sulla in the east, who had hunted Sertorius through the passes of Spain under Pompey, who knew what discipline looked like when it was operating at full pressure. Plutarch tells us Crassus paid them at rates that made personal loyalty to him more profitable than any abstract notion of the Republic. 6 legions, around 30,000 men on the rolls, perhaps closer to 40,000 once the auxiliary cavalry and the wreckage of the previous campaigns were folded in. Equipped, drilled, and owned. Not Rome's army. His army. Every iron rivet, every sack of spelt in the supply wagons, every copper as in a soldier's pouch, ran back along a single thread to one man's accounts. If you wanted to see what Crassus believed about the relationship between money and power, you did not need to read his speeches in the Senate. You only needed to look at the column of men he had built by the close of autumn 72 BC and understand what it was. A net worth, forged into iron, pointed at a problem. The political ground he stood on made that arithmetic necessary. The consuls Lucius Gellius Publicola and Gnaeus Cornelius Lentulus Clodianus had been beaten in the field that same year. Publius Varinius had been beaten before them. Gaius Claudius Glaber had been the first to fall, trapped on the slopes of Vesuvius by rebels who climbed down the cliffs on ropes woven from wild vines. The Senate had run out of magistrates willing to take the field. Pompey was still in Spain, finishing off the remnants of Sertorius's revolt. Lucullus was in the east, fighting Mithridates of Pontus. There was no one left in Rome who wanted the command. Crassus did. He had asked for it. And the Senate, in the awkward winter session of late 72 BC, had granted him imperium with the title of praetor pro consul, an irregular arrangement that gave him authority, but reminded him daily that he had no legal claim to a triumph if he won. He understood the trap. He accepted it anyway. But 6 clean legions were not the whole inheritance. He also received the wreckage. The survivors of the armies once led by Publicola and Lentulus marched into his camp near Picenum like men carrying a contagion. They had stood in line against Spartacus and walked away breathing, which sounded like a credential until you watched them eat. They flinched when a tent pole dropped. They moved through their duties with the dead-eyed precision of men whose bodies remembered the work their minds had stopped doing. Some of them, according to the fragments preserved in Appian, woke in the night calling out names of officers already buried in shallow graves outside Mutina. Their officers had been beaten in open battle by an enemy that Roman doctrine classified as livestock that had wandered off. The wound from that kind of defeat went lower than ordinary fear. It was not only that they had lost, it was that they had lost to a thing the entire scaffolding of Roman thought said could not win. The jurist Gaius would later write that a slave was a res, a thing, not a person, a category of property. These men had been defeated by furniture. Their identity as Roman soldiers had been broken on Thracian spear points, and they had not yet picked the fragments off the ground. In plain military terms, they were finished. Worse than finished. Send them into line beside fresh recruits, and their fear would travel sideways through the ranks like damp rot through a beam. Crassus saw it the moment they arrived. A lifetime of reading failing investments had given him an eye for the kind of problem that cannot be patched, only excised. He could not replace the men. He could replace the thing they were afraid of. The instrument he reached for had not been used in Rome's armies for generations. The last serious application had been under Lucius Calpurnius Piso in the early 2nd century BC, in the slave war on Sicily. Decimation, from decim, 10, was a punishment so naked, so engineered to be unjust, that Roman commanders had shunned it for decades out of a quiet fear of what reaching for it said about their own situation. The principle was clean. If a unit broke, mutinied, or showed cowardice that crossed a line, every 10th man in that unit died. Not the cowards, not the ringleaders. Every 10th man, chosen by lot. The innocent died at exactly the same rate as the guilty. That was not a defect in the design. That was the design. Decimation was built to install one specific texture of fear, the kind that does not care what kind of man you are. A brave soldier could pull the wrong tablet and be beaten to death by his own tentmates, while the coward beside him watched. You could not pray your way out of it. You could not perform your way out of it. The only protection was to make sure your unit never gave the commander a reason. Crassus selected the cohorts that had broken most visibly. Plutarch puts the number at 500 men drawn from the worst of them, divided into 50 groups of 10. Appian preserves a slightly different figure but the same structure. The mathematics did not change. The formation was conducted on a frost-hardened parade ground outside the winter camp, in the cold light of an Italian December. The ground rang under hobnailed boots. The men were drawn up in their centuries, breath visible, standards planted in the dirt at the head of each unit. The lots were prepared, small wooden tablets, sortes marked on one side, passed in a bronze helmet that moved down the line carried by a tribune of the soldiers. Each man reached in blind. The arithmetic did the rest. For every 10 men who drew clean and stepped aside, one drew the mark and was brought forward. Sometimes walking, sometimes carried under the arms by men who had drawn safety. Then the 9 survivors were handed clubs. Not swords. Clubs. Roman tradition specified the fustuarium, death by wooden club, the same punishment the historian Polybius had described over a century earlier for sentries who fell asleep on watch. The weapons were stacked in a wagon at the edge of the field. Ash wood, the length of a man's forearm, weighted at the head. The centurions handed them out one by one. A sword is distance. A club is labor. You feel it in your shoulders. You feel the shock run back through the wood into your wrists. The killing was meant to take time, and meant to be done by the hands of the man's own friends. Stand in that group of 9. The man across from you is someone whose hometown you know. You have eaten beside him for months. You know the name of his mother in Etruria, the name of the girl he writes to in Capua, the small bronze charm of Fortuna he keeps tied to his belt. He has just drawn the mark. The tribune is watching. The centurions are watching. Crassus is watching from a raised tribunal of stacked turf, wrapped in a commander's paludamentum, his face arranged with the calm of a man checking columns in a ledger. The lictors stand below him, their fasces bundled and visible. There is no argument left. The mathematics has already finished. The only question is whether you swing first or swing last. The first blow made a sound that no one who heard it would describe the same way twice. A wet crack. Bone and tissue absorbing wood. The man did not drop at once. He staggered. He may have made a noise. Then the other 8 clubs came down, and the procedure took over, and it went on past the point of necessity, because to stop early would have looked like hesitation. And hesitation that day carried its own price. 50 such groups. 500 men. The ground stayed frozen for days afterward, the blood black on the white frost, where the burial details had not yet finished their work. Crassus said nothing from the tribunal. He did not need to. The speech was being delivered in the dirt below him. When it was finished, he addressed the army. The exact words were not preserved with the kind of fidelity we would want, but Plutarch's account leaves no doubt about the message. Crassus had recalculated the arithmetic of fear. Before that morning, a soldier facing Spartacus had a distant chance of death in battle and a near-certain chance of survival if he ran. Crassus had revised the equation. Now there was a guaranteed death waiting behind the line. Indifferent. Owned by him. Spartacus might kill you. Crassus would. The distinction was not delicate. It was numeric. What rose out of that ground was not courage. Do not confuse what Crassus built with courage. The army that marched from his winter camp through the early months of 71 BC was tight, exact, and silent in the specific way that frightened men are silent once they have given up on hope and started calculating survival. They dressed their lines with the precision of men who understood that sloppy spacing carried a personal price. They held march intervals through the broken country of Lucania that would have stretched a confident column out of shape. They obeyed their centurions without the half-second lag that combat stress puts into ordinary human reflex. As an instrument, they were superb. They were not bound together by glory or by the warmth of shared hardship. They were bound by a cold adhesive. Terror pointed at the man behind them. Crassus had not inspired his army. He had compressed it. He had squeezed the slack and the softness and the human unpredictability out of it, until what was left was dense enough to use as a hammer. When his force was finally complete and moving, his opening play was not the one Rome wanted. The Republic wanted a decision, a pitched battle on some southern plain where the legions could deploy by the book and the affair could be closed with proper Roman steel. The grain dealers of Ostia wanted it. The senators with country estates in Campania wanted it. The crowds in the Subura, whose bread prices were climbing with every week the war dragged on, wanted it loudest of all. Crassus refused them all. He marched his army into range of Spartacus, and then he held. He did not offer battle. He matched movement for movement, kept his distance, and began dismantling the machinery that kept 70,000 people alive in the open country. The rebel host had a problem that worsened by the week. It was enormous. 70,000 mouths. Fighters, families, the freed, the desperate, the believers, the opportunists, burned through grain, water, firewood, and bandages at a rate that required ceaseless foraging across wide territory. Spartacus had handled this through motion. An army that keeps walking can strip a region and slip away before the locals organize. Crassus understood that lifeline and began cutting it strand by strand. He sent cavalry, fast, light, splitting in several directions at once, to catch foraging parties before they could return. Among his cavalry commanders was a young Lucius Quinctius, who would later distinguish himself in the Eastern Wars. Mummius, another lieutenant Plutarch names directly, was given a separate column with instructions that would shortly be ignored, with consequences we will reach in due course. The foraging interdiction was not just to kill, it was to scatter, to burn what they had gathered, to make them stagger back to camp empty-handed. He had wells poisoned or blocked on the ground ahead of Spartacus's projected route. He burned grain stores in villages before the rebel column could reach them, paying compensation in silver to the landowners, quietly, from his own purse, building a network of obligations across southern Italy that would survive the war. He used his cavalry advantage to pick off stragglers, the sick, the wounded, the separated, the soft edge of the rebel body, with the steady patience of a butcher trimming fat from bone. He was not trying to win a battle. He was trying to make a battle unnecessary. A second factor worked for him that he had not arranged. The rebel coalition was cracking from inside, and the crack ran between Spartacus and a Gallic captain named Crixus, with a second Gallic leader, Oenomaus, having already fallen in earlier fighting. The sources do not preserve the specific arguments in detail, but the shape of the split is visible in what followed. Spartacus's strategy was long. He wanted to drive the army north, cross the Alps through the Brenner or the Mont Genèvre, and dissolve. Let each contingent slip toward its homeland or vanish into a world large enough to make recapture pointless. It was the plan of a man who knew Rome's military arithmetic and wanted to step out of it, not break it. Crixus wanted something else. He wanted to stay. He wanted to burn the countryside of Lucania and Apulia, the very regions where many of his Gauls had been worked to death in the great latifundia. He wanted to extract vengeance from the soil that had owned them. He spoke for the part of the rebellion that measured victory in Roman corpses, not in miles. They separated in the spring of 71 B. Crixus took perhaps 30,000 men, Gauls and Germans largely, and moved on his own track through Apulia. Crassus watched it happen with what was likely the closest thing he experienced to pleasure, expressed in his case as a quiet adjustment of plans. He sent a detachment under his lieutenant Quintus Marcius Rufus and the praetor Quintus Arrius to chase Crixus down. The result was clean. Near Mount Garganus, the limestone promontory that juts into the Adriatic like a stone fist, the Romans broke Crixus's force in a battle Livy's epitomators tell us cost the rebels 2/3 of their strength in a single afternoon. Crixus himself was killed in the fighting. His body, according to one tradition preserved in the fragments of Sallust's histories, was identified by the Gallic torque he wore around his neck. The internal argument of the rebellion had delivered Crassus a manageable battle against a slice of the enemy. Spartacus learned of Crixus's death while still moving with the main column through the highlands of Lucania. The sources tell us he staged funeral games for him, forcing some 300 Roman prisoners to fight one another to the death in gladiatorial pairs, while his army watched from the slopes of a natural amphitheater, a reversal of the precise machinery that had created the war. A former gladiator from the school of Lentulus Batiatus in Capua, sold to kill for an audience, now using captured Romans to do the killing while his own army watched. The symmetry was sharp. Appian preserves the detail. It told you something about the moral architecture of the man behind it. But it was also a funeral, which meant the rebellion, whatever it could still do in the field, had just buried a large portion of its strength on a hillside in Apulia, while its best general failed to reach the fight in time. Crassus noted it. He noted all of it. Before we walk into the trap Crassus is about to spring, one of the most audacious engineering operations the Roman military ever attempted. There is something I want to say directly to you, because you are clearly someone who treats this history seriously. The people who keep this channel breathing, the ones who go past watching and actually stand behind the work, are our Praetorian Guard, the channel's membership community. In ancient Rome, the Praetorian Guard were the emperor's own picked cohort, the men who stood between the throne and everything that came for it. Our version keeps Romanus alive at the membership level, and in return, they get early access to videos before the public release, exclusive content, and the knowledge that they are personally responsible for these stories reaching the screen at full quality. If you have been watching and feeling the connection to this material, if you want Roman history done right, this is your moment. Take your post, join the Praetorian Guard through the membership link below, and step into the inner circle that makes Romanus possible. Spartacus turned south. The reasons were strategic. and inside the logic of his situation, sound. The north was now a maze. Roman columns were converging. Crixus was dead. The Senate, alarmed by the casualties, had begun recalling Pompey from Spain, a fact Spartacus's scouts, drawn from runaway slaves with ears in every market town, would have learned within weeks. The Alpine route that had once looked like a clean exit had become contested ground. Sicily offered a different door. The island had a memory of rebellion. The great Servile Wars under Eunice of Enna in 135 BC and Salvius Tryphon and Athenian between 104 and 100 BC had proven that the slave population there could rise, could hold land, could fight in formation, could even crown kings, and mint their own coinage. The grain estates of central Sicily still ran on the labor of chained men whose grandfathers had marched in those armies. If Spartacus could move his force across the Strait of Messina, 3 miles of water at its narrowest, he could open a second front on ground where Rome's supply lines were longer, and the local mood was, if not friendly, at least known to combust. He needed ships. He needed them quickly. He found his sellers among the Cilician pirates, working the waters off southern Italy. Men with no allegiance to Rome, who priced everything in coin, who had been operating with effective impunity since Marcus Antonius, the praetor, had failed to suppress them in 74 BC. In exchange for a heavy payment in gold and silver, pulled from the looted villas of Lucania, their captains agreed to provide transport. He marched the army through the rugged interior of Bruttium, the toe of Italy, country of oak forests and stone villages, and he made his camp on the heights above the strait. From the bluffs above Rhegium, his men could see the smoke of fires on the Sicilian shore. He waited for the fleet. It never came. The Cilicians took the gold. Then they were gone, back into the water they lived on, with no more obligation to a Thracian slave general than a gull has to the cliff it nests on. Plutarch suggests Verres, the rapacious Roman governor of Sicily, whose later trial would make Cicero's career, may have paid them more to disappear than Spartacus had paid them to ferry. Their absence left Spartacus standing at the edge of the peninsula with the sea ahead of him, a starving and increasingly furious army behind him, and something else taking shape across the neck of land at his back. A wall. Because Crassus had not been still while Spartacus moved south. The wall went up in winter. Crassus had read the geography of Bruttium the instant Spartacus committed to the southern march, and he had run the numbers with the speed of a man who had been waiting for this specific opening. The toe of Italy, the narrow strip the Romans called Bruttium, hemmed by the Tyrrhenian Sea on the west and the Ionian on the east, was joined to the rest of the peninsula by an isthmus roughly 40 Roman miles across. Plutarch gives the figure as 300 stadia, 40 miles of land. That was the entire gap between Spartacus and the world north of him. 40 miles is a construction project. Crassus ordered it sealed. The specifications in Plutarch and Appian are not metaphors. This was a real piece of military engineering, a fossa 15 feet deep and 15 feet wide, cut into the limestone and red clay of the isthmus, across the full 40-mile span. Behind it, a rampart of packed earth and timber rose to a height that could not be crossed without ladders, ropes, and the kind of discipline a starving army could not muster. The labor required was enormous. Crassus had 6 legions under direct command, soon 8 with reinforcements drawn from the consular survivors he had rehabilitated through fear, and he set them to work in shifts. Men in the trench with mattock and dolabra, the Roman entrenching pick that doubled as a close-quarter weapon. Men hauling spoil up the back slope to raise the agger. Men cutting stakes from the oak and cork forests of the Scylla highlands and sharpening them into the lilies and stingers Caesar would later describe in his own works. Cavalry patrols screening the work parties from any sortie out of the rebel camp. Roman legionaries were trained engineers. They built marching forts every night of a campaign season, complete with ditch and palisade after a full day's march. They knew the work. The historian Josephus, writing a century later about a similar siege line at Jerusalem, would call it the signature of Rome. The army that turned shovels into a strategy. But 40 miles in winter, on ground that broke axe handles in places, demanded a tempo that would have ground men down even in warmer months. The sources tell us he worked them in rotation, hot food brought up from field kitchens at the rear, fires kept burning along the line by night, so the work could continue past sundown. Frostbite cases were carried back to the surgeons. The dead, of which there were some, were buried behind the agger as the wall advanced over them. From above, if you could have hung over Brutium that winter, the picture would have organized itself for you. To the south, Spartacus's camp, a sprawl of smoke and tents and improvised shelters covering ground larger than most Italian towns, generating the noise and heat and refuse of a city of 70,000. Across the northern horizon of that camp, a line of turned earth and driven timber lengthening visibly by the day, sea to sea, like a suture closing a wound, like a lid being pressed down on a box. The men inside the box could see it. Every morning they watched the line extend a little further across their world. They could not stop it. Every probing raid ran into Crassus's cavalry screen and the forward cohorts placed to defend the diggers. The wall grew. The trap closed. When it was finished, Crassus had done something with no clean precedent in Roman military history. He had not defeated his enemy. He had redrawn the map of Italy to make defeating his enemy unnecessary. The ditch and rampart said one thing very precisely to Spartacus and to the watching Senate. This is no longer a war. This is a liquidation. You are a distressed asset. I am the man who buys those. In Rome, the news of the wall arrived in the form of dispatches read aloud in the Curia. Cicero, then a young senator on the rise, would later remember the mood of those weeks in his correspondence. A city that had spent 3 years afraid of a slave army was suddenly told the slave army was inside a box. Grain prices in the markets along the Tiber, which had climbed steadily through the war years, began to ease. The shippers of Ostia started planning the spring trade again. The wall in Brutium was rebuilding the Roman economy from 400 miles away. Inside the wall, winter arrived with the specific cruelty the Italian South reserves for people without roofs and without grain. The Cilicians had vanished with the gold. The foraging range had been stripped clean by Crassus's cavalry through the autumn. The granaries of Lucania and Brutium were burned or empty. What remained inside the perimeter was already insufficient for 70,000 mouths, and no resupply was coming. The ration shrank first from inadequate to dangerous, then from dangerous to the threshold below which the human body begins to eat itself. Ancient sources record disease moving through the camp in those weeks. They do not name the illnesses, but the conditions write the list themselves. Dysentery from contaminated water, respiratory infections among men sleeping under brushwood roofs, wound rot in fighters whose injuries had been carried for 2 years across half the peninsula, lice, the slow fevers that follow cold and starvation in the same bed. Children of the camp followers died first, as they always do in famines, their small bodies giving up the fight before the adults. The dead were not always buried quickly, because the living who would have buried them were conserving energy. Fires burned through the night, not for warmth, but but because warmth was the difference between waking up and not waking up. Horses were eaten down to the hooves. Leather was boiled and chewed. The accounts of later slave wars and of comparable famines in Roman siege history, like Numantia under Scipio Aemilianus, suggest what is rarely written into the surviving lines of Plutarch and Appian, that in the worst weeks, the dead may have been doing more than filling a ditch. On the Roman side of the wall, in the long nights, the sentries heard the acoustic evidence of a community dying. The coughing that did not stop. The arguments between men whose judgment hunger had eroded. And sometimes, in the gaps between gusts of wind, the specific silence of a section of camp that had stopped making noise because the people in it no longer could. Crassus sat in his command tent on the north side of the wall and went over his ledger. Plutarch tells us he kept the accounts of the war personally, reviewing supply manifests and pay rolls each evening with his freedmen secretaries. He had converted an open military problem into a closed logistical one. He was not winning a battle. He was waiting for a position to mature. But Spartacus had not lain down to die. The question of how much Crassus actually engineered the betrayal of the Cilicians has occupied historians for 2,000 years. The honest answer is that the surviving sources do not give us a confession. Plutarch implies the possibility without sealing it. What we can say is that the pirate captains operated in waters thick with Roman commerce, that they ran a sophisticated mercenary network that priced loyalty by the hour, and that Crassus had more silver than a Thracian fugitive could match. There is a quieter possibility, too, raised by Plutarch's own narrative, that Gaius Verus, then governing Sicily and squeezing the province for every coin he could extract, intervened to keep the rebels off his island. Verus had reasons of his own to want Sicily quiet. The slave estates of Enna and Henna, and the grain plains around Leontinoi, sat on the same fault line that had cracked open twice in the previous century. A third Sicilian slave war on his watch would have ended his career and possibly his neck. Cicero, prosecuting Verus a few years later in the famous Verrines, would catalogue every form of corruption the man had practiced in Sicily. Bribing pirates not to ferry rebels fits the profile. Whether the counterpayment came from Crassus directly or from Verus acting in his own interest, the result was identical. The fleet did not come. The sea route closed. The wall stood. And 70,000 people found themselves wedged between Roman engineering and the Mediterranean, with no door out. Spartacus did not accept the math. He tried to negotiate. The sources are clear on this. He sent emissaries to the wall asking for terms. Not for mercy, but for a formal meeting between commanders. Crassus refused each approach without conversation, without a counter-offer, without even acknowledging the heralds with a reply. The refusal was deliberate. To negotiate was to grant the other man a kind of standing he was not willing to concede. Crassus was not at war with a fellow general. He was a property owner managing an escaped asset. You do not parley with a fire. You wait for the fuel to run out. The breakout came on a winter night, in a snowstorm. The timing was chosen for the reason commanders have always chosen storms and darkness. They blind the defender while the attacker is already moving on a known map. The rebels could not see the wall from a distance in the blizzard, but they knew exactly where it stood. They had been looking at it for weeks. Spartacus organized the assault with the precision that had marked his best work in the war. The fossa had to be crossed. It was the most difficult element of the line, 15 feet down into rock and dirt, and the rebels had no siege equipment. They crossed it with the only material they had in sufficient quantity: their own dead. The detail sits in Appian with a flat brevity that somehow sharpens it. The bodies of men and horses who had died in the camp through the autumn and winter, from hunger, from sickness, from cold, were dragged in the dark, in the snow, to the lip of the ditch and thrown in. With them went earth scraped from the camp floor, brushwood, branches, spear shafts, captured Roman shields used as fascines, anything with mass that could partially fill a 15-foot cut. Spartacus's fighters then used this bridge, a causeway built from their own dead, to assault the rampart. Plutarch puts the breakout force at 1/3 of the army. Other figures vary. The exact fraction shifts between accounts. The core fact does not. Enough of the rebel host got across to break Spartacus loose from the trap. The Romans on that section of the wall fought, in the snow, in the dark, against men who had given up the idea of safety and were therefore moving with the speed and weight of the completely committed. The defenders gave ground. The pila came down in the first volley. Then the gladius work began, close in, where snow and blood mix on a man's hands until he cannot tell which is which. Crassus, according to Plutarch, executed several officers afterward for their performance at the breach. Another line in the discipline ledger. But the breach had happened. Spartacus was north of the ditch. What had he actually won? The question deserves a direct answer, because the breakout is sometimes told as a triumph. And it was not a triumph. It was a survival. The army that crossed the wall was not the army that had marched into Brutium in the autumn. These men were starving, sleep-stripped, carrying the cumulative damage of a winter of insufficient calories and no field hospital. And they had just spent a night in the snow charging across a bridge of frozen corpses. They were alive. That was better than the alternative. But the coherent, mobile, strategically supple force that had broken two consular armies was gone. What remained was a column of desperate human beings held together by the gravity of Spartacus's will and the absence of any door-marked exit. Crassus watched the breakout with the calm of a man who had not assumed permanence. He had never believed the wall would hold a cornered army indefinitely. He was Roman enough to know that men with nothing to lose fight at a rate that makes containment expensive. The wall had been designed to degrade the rebel force to a specific level of weakness, to strip its logistics, its numbers, its physical condition. The breakout told him the wall had done its job. The animal had chewed its own leg off to escape, and it was now bleeding in open country. He reorganized and followed north. What he could not control, what was about to force his hand in a way the cold arithmetic of his personality registered as a genuine threat, was riding east out of Spain. Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, Pompey the Great. He was bringing his veteran legions home after years of grinding war against Quintus Sertorius in Hispania, a war that had finally ended only because Sertorius had been murdered at a banquet by his own lieutenant, Marcus Perperna, in 73 BC, leaving the remnants of his army to collapse under Pompey's pursuit. The Senate, in the classic overcorrection of a body that had been frightened for 3 years running, had sent Pompey orders to march south on Spartacus and end the matter. From Pompey's side, this was not a complication. It was a gift. He had spent years in Spain fighting an attritional campaign in mountain country, with no decisive engagement to hang a reputation on. He was 35 years old. He had already been hailed imperator in the field, already worn the toga praetexta of a triumphator, before he was old enough to sit in the Senate. He needed one more name to write into his legend. Here was Italy. Here was the most famous slave war in Roman memory. Here was a chance to ride in at the final hour and walk away with the kill. From Crassus's side, this was the most dangerous development of the entire war. Not militarily. Crassus had the rebel force contained, weakened, and running. He did not need Pompey's veterans to close the matter. The danger was political. It was personal. The two men were already rivals in a way that would shape the next 20 years of Roman politics. Both had served under Sulla. Both had grown rich in the proscriptions of the 80s BC, when names were posted in the forum and the property of the listed transferred to whoever brought the head. Pompey had been Sulla's favored son. Crassus had been the patient accumulator. They watched each other constantly. He had spent not just his fortune, but his identity on this war. He had stepped forward when the Senate had nothing left. He had funded, equipped, built, and commanded the operation that had turned the tide. He had absorbed the embarrassment of his lieutenant Mummius, who against direct orders had engaged Spartacus in the field early in the campaign and been beaten badly enough that Crassus had decimated the worst of his cohorts in front of the whole army. He had ordered the killing of Roman citizens by their own comrades, a measure no commander in living memory had dared, accepting the political cost because the alternative was losing the war. He had built the wall. He had starved the army inside it. And the prize he wanted, the triumphus, the procession along the Via Sacra past the Temple of Saturn and up to the Capitoline, the laurel and the painted face and the slave whispering memento mori in his ear, was about to be picked up by a man who had not spent a single sestertius on the war and had not faced Spartacus in the field even once. Crassus needed to finish this before Pompey arrived. The calculation was that simple. The war could no longer move at its optimal pace. It had to be accelerated. He pushed his legions harder. He tightened the pursuit. He forced engagements that under different circumstances he might have approached with more care. And something else was working in his favor from the rebel side of the equation. Spartacus was losing his grip on the men who remained. Two of his lieutenants, the sources name them Castus and Gannicus, Gauls who had been with the Rising since its early months in Capua, made the same decision Crixus had made. They split. They peeled away from the main column with their own factions and operated separately. The argument seems to have been the same one that had cracked the army before. Spartacus wanted to withdraw and survive. They wanted to fight. Crassus turned a portion of his force on the separated group and broke it. The engagement near Cantena in Lucania, fought beside a lake the locals called Lucanus, and a second action near Petilia in the highlands of Bruttium destroyed Castus and Gannicus and killed thousands. Appian preserves a specific figure, 2,300 rebel dead, in a single engagement, with wounds on the front, not the back. They had died facing the line. The detail mattered to Crassus as a talking point in his dispatches to Rome, and it mattered to the sources who preserved it as a measure of how far past hope these men had moved. They were no longer choosing whether to die. They were choosing where. Plutarch adds another small horror to the record. At Cantena, 2 women of the rebel camp were found dead on the field, weapons in their hands. The Roman troops, picking through the corpses, paused over them in a way the sources thought worth noting. Spartacus received each piece of news and reorganized around the shrinking core that remained. He was now operating with a fraction of the force that had once crossed the Apennines and burned its way through Roman Italy. He moved north, possibly toward Brundisium on the Adriatic, where he might have hoped to find ships from the Eastern Greek world, or simply to put distance between his column and Crassus's cavalry. The port of Brundisium was the Roman gateway to Greece and the East, and the sources suggest he may have hoped to cross to Illyria or beyond. He never reached it. Marcus Licinius, the brother of the famous Lucullus, and recently returned with his own legions from a campaign in Thrace, was already at Brundisium with a fresh army. The door east was shut, too. Crassus's horse caught the rear guard near the Silarus River, in Lucania, in the spring of 71 BC, and forced the matter. Before we walk into that last confrontation, the final hours of an army that had shaken an empire, there is something worth pausing on. The source book that formed the spine of today's research into Spartacus, Crassus, and the mechanics of the Third Servile War is available right now through the View Products button on your screen. This is not a casual overview. It is a dense, fully sourced synthesis of the ancient material, the military analysis, and the social history of this conflict, and it will change how you see the late Republic. It built the backbone of what you are watching, and if you want to take the full depth of this story home with you, you need it on your shelf. Alongside it on the shop, you will find other themed artifacts, pieces curated for people who take Rome seriously. I will let you find them yourself. Some of what is there may surprise you. These are not casual souvenirs. They are objects for collectors of the empire. Spartacus had one move left. He used it. When the Roman cavalry pressed his rear guard near the Silurus, he did not look for another negotiation or another escape line. He turned the army and marched toward Crassus's main force with the explicit intention of forcing a decision. The accounts tell us he had spoken to his men in the days before. The exact speech is almost certainly a reconstruction by later writers, but the strategic reality it reflects is genuine. Spartacus knew the war was finishing. He knew Pompey was on the road. He knew Lucullus was at Brundisium. He knew his column could not survive another season being hunted through Italy. If there was going to be an end, he would choose the ground and the hour. He killed his own horse in front of the army before the battle began. The sources agree on the act, and it is worth sitting with. A general's horse was not transport. In Roman and Hellenistic military culture, a commander's mount was the instrument of his control, the means by which he moved between threatened sectors, rallied broken cohorts, and escaped if the line collapsed. The horse Spartacus killed was reportedly a fine animal, and he killed it with his own sword, on the ground in front of the assembled army, so that every man in the front ranks saw the blood on the snow. The gesture had a name in the warrior cultures of Thrace and Gaul. It was a vow taken with iron. He was not going to rally. He was not going to escape. He was going to fight in the line beside the men who had followed him out of the gladiatorial barracks at Capua 2 years before, and whatever happened to them was going to happen to him in the same minute at the same place. One of Crassus's officers brought word of the act to the command tent, expecting it to confirm that the enemy commander had cracked. Plutarch tells us Crassus answered with something close to admiration, or at least recognition. He understood the logic of the gesture, even if he would never have made it himself. The armies set themselves on the field near the Silurus, in country the Romans knew as Lucania, near the headwaters of the river where it cuts down from the Apennines toward the Tyrrhenian coast. The ground there is rolling, broken by olive groves and stone outcrops, the kind of country where a line of legionaries could deploy in proper depth, and where a cavalry envelopment had room to swing wide. Crassus had chosen the field with care, or accepted the one Spartacus had given him. On one side, the dressed lines of Crassus's legions, the best equipment his fortune had bought them, held in formation by the cold adhesive the fustuarium had installed. Silent, exact, pointed forward like a machine waiting to be switched on. Eagles forward. Aquilifers at the head of each legion. The young Marcus Porcius Cato, who would later become the famous Cato the Younger, served as a military tribune in this campaign and was reportedly in the line that day, refusing the decorations Crassus later offered him because he believed the war had been beneath the dignity of Rome. On the other, the remnant of an army that had once filled the width of southern Italy, now thin, ragged, many of them fighting with captured Roman gear that did not fit them, every one of them carrying the physical marks of a winter that had tried to kill them before the legions ever reached them. The gap between the two lines began to close. The battle began the way these things begin, when one side runs on willpower and the other runs on procedure. Fast. Loud. Decided in the first minutes by men who did not yet realize the decision had been made. Spartacus drove his army straight at the Roman center. Not at the wings. Not at the baggage train. Not at the cavalry screening the flanks. He aimed at the densest formation in the line, the cohorts holding the standards, the ground where Crassus stood under the red paludamentum with his staff and his lictors. The choice was not subtle. If the Republic could be cracked at all, it would crack there in the next quarter hour, under the weight of men who no longer had a tomorrow to preserve. This was the philosophy that had run the rebellion since the first night on Vesuvius 2 years earlier. Concentrated force, direct contact, the refusal to fight on terms set by a stronger opponent. It had worked against Glaber on the mountain in 73 BC, when 78 escaped gladiators had descended the cliffs on vine ropes and slaughtered 3,000 Roman militia in their sleep. It had worked against Varinius's lieutenant Furius later that summer. It had worked at the second engagement against Varinius himself, when the rebels had crossed a deserted camp and left a corpse propped on a stake by the gate to simulate a sentry while they slipped past in the dark. It would not work today. The legionaries received the charge behind the scutum. The front rank planted the lower edge of the shield against the earth and angled the top into the chest. The second rank pressed forward into the backs of the first, doubling the mass. The third rank readied pila to be passed up over the heads of the men in front. The fourth rank, drawn from the cohorts Crassus had specifically rebuilt with the decimation survivors, stood with drawn gladi in case any part of the wall in front of them gave way. Roman infantry doctrine had been refined over centuries for exactly this scenario, beginning with the Camillan reforms after the Gallic sack of 390 BC, and finalized by Gaius Marius in the years before the social war. The locked shield wall absorbed the moving body until its momentum bled out against the resistance, and then the counterwork began. The pila came first. Each legionary carried 2, a heavy version for short range, a lighter throwing version for longer cast. The iron shanks of the pilum were deliberately soft below the head, designed to bend on impact so the weapon could not be picked up and thrown back. When the rebel charge entered killing range, perhaps 20 meters out, the first volley left the Roman line in a synchronized arc that darkened the air over the field for 1 full second before it landed. Men in the rebel front rank died standing. Others were pinned where the pilum punched through shield and arm in the same penetration, locking the shield to the body, forcing the man to drop both or fight one-armed. The second volley followed before the first had finished arriving. Then the wave reached the shields. The gladius was not a weapon for duels. It was an industrial tool, a short, broad blade 20 inches long, designed for the upward thrust delivered by a man standing shoulder against shoulder with his brothers on the left and right, protected from his clavicle down by a wall of curved wood and iron boss, invisible to the man trying to kill him. The blade went up under the ribs into the lung. It went into the groin where the femoral artery runs close to the surface, a wound that bleeds out a grown man in under 90 seconds. It went into the armpit when an enemy raised his sword arm to strike downward. Cut, step forward over the body, cut again. A manufacturing line for casualties. The rebel wave hit and did not break the center. That has to be said clearly, because the men who charged that morning were neither cowards nor amateurs. They had broken Glaber on Vesuvius. They had broken Varinius in Campania. They had broken Publicola and Lentulus in the same season. They had crawled out of a sealed ditch on a causeway built from their own dead. What met them at the Silaris was a different animal. the engineered product of the fustuarium and a winter of brutal drilling, a machine built specifically not to break. The wave crashed against it. The Roman line bent and held, then began to walk forward. 1 step, 2, 3, the measured advance of men with energy in reserve against men who had spent everything in the first 10 minutes. Spartacus fought in the front rank. Every source confirms it. Plutarch is specific in the life of Crassus. Chapter 11. Spartacus was visible in the press, moving toward the place where Crassus's tribunes had set the command standards, hacking through the men in his path. He killed 2 centurions before he went down. The centurion was the spine of the Roman line, identifiable by the transverse crest on the helmet, the vites staff that signaled rank, the phalarai discs of bronze and silver mounted on a harness over the chest. To kill 2 of them in succession in a battle line was the work of a man who had decided where his life was going to end, and was choosing only how many would go with him. Appian preserves a different detail. He tells us Spartacus had attempted to reach Crassus personally, and had broken through 2 ranks of the bodyguard before a Roman thrust caught him in the thigh. He went down to 1 knee, planted his shield against the ground in front of him, and continued fighting from that position until the legionaries closed over him. The thigh wound is the kind of detail that does not survive in invented narratives. A thigh strike from below is the natural killing motion of a man working in the second rank of a shield wall, thrusting upward under the enemy's protection. Appian's source for the civil wars, probably the lost history of Asinius Pollio, who wrote within living memory of these events, was preserving a specific tactical moment from a battlefield account. The ancient sources do not preserve the moment of his death in fuller detail. The press of bodies in the later phases of the battle made individual deaths impossible to witness or record. His body was never identified. That fact deserves a pause. He was not hidden. He was not carried off by loyalists trying to preserve a relic. The battlefield at the Silarus became the kind of landscape in which identity dissolves on its own. The Romans took the field by mid-afternoon. By dusk, the corpses were stacked 3 and 4 deep in the worst sections, blood and mud combining until the footing was no longer earth. The valley of the Silarus, which runs west out of the Apennines through limestone country and reaches the Tyrrhenian Sea at Paestum, holds the heat of late spring in its low places. The bodies were already beginning their work by the next morning. Spartacus may have stripped his command insignia before the charge, knowing that recognition meant being targeted by every junior officer hunting decorations. Whatever the precise mechanism, the man who had broken Roman armies for 2 years became one anonymous corpse among the heap. Crassus sent men to comb the field afterward. The search parties moved through the dead with the standards of the rebel column for reference, asking captured survivors who had served close to him for identifying features. They found weapons consistent with his position. They found horses with rebel tack. They did not find a face. For a commander of a different temperament, this would have stung. The triumph procession required something to display. A captive in chains, a corpse on a hook, a war trophy that proved the kill. The triumph of Aemilius Paulus over Macedon in 167 BC had paraded King Perseus and his children through the streets. The triumph that Pompey would celebrate over Mithridates in 61 BC would carry images of the Pontic king's death. A general without a body had to improvise. For Crassus, there is reason to think the outcome served him exactly as he needed. A martyr requires a grave. A symbol requires a body to mourn over. A man who dies anonymously, buried under the anonymous dead of an unmarked field, becomes statistics. Crassus had not just put down a rebellion, He had erased its author from the surface where memory anchors. The survivors who had not died on the field and had not slipped into the hills were taken in the thousands. Roman practice after a battle of this scale involved a routine, separating those who could be sold from those who would be put to death, cataloging the captured for the slave markets at Capua and Puteoli, where the original revolt had begun 2 years earlier, beginning the accounting. Crassus did not stay long in that process. He had a message to compose, and he had already chosen the medium. 6,000. The number appears in Appian's Civil Wars, Book 1, Chapter 120, with consistency. 6,000 prisoners taken alive after the battle were crucified along the Appian Way. The Via Appia ran from the Porta Capena in Rome south through Campania, past Capua, where the rising had begun in the gladiatorial school of Lentulus Batiatus, all the way down toward Brundisium and the Adriatic. 200 kilometers of basalt paving stones laid by the censor Appius Claudius Caecus in 312 BC, the oldest of Rome's great roads, the Regina Viarum, Queen of Roads, as Statius would later call it, the artery along which the Republic moved its grain, its legions, its couriers, and its slaves. The road ran past the Alban Hills with their lakes and senatorial villas. It crossed the Pomptine Marshes on a causeway built generations earlier. It climbed through the pass at Terracina, where the cliff face had been cut sheer above the sea. It descended into the plain of Campania, past the temples of Capua, and the gladiatorial barracks where the war had begun. Every stage of the road carried a memory. Crassus ordered crosses raised along the full length of that road. 1 man per cross. The spacing was measured. The sources suggest intervals of roughly 40 paces. The arithmetic of 6,000 crosses over the relevant section of the route works to a cross every 33 meters, more or less continuously, from Rome to Capua. No traveler on the Appian Way could ride the road and lose sight of the dying or the dead. The work crews who raised the crosses were Roman engineers and conscripted local labor, working from carts of pre-cut timber that followed the columns south. The uprights were planted in shallow holes pickaxed into the earth shoulder by the road. The condemned man was nailed to the crossbeam on the ground, through the wrists, between the bones of the forearm where the tendons would bear weight without tearing free. And then the beam was lifted and fitted into a notch on the upright. The feet were nailed last, 1 foot over the other against the wood, the iron driven through the arch into the timber behind. Crucifixion killed by a combination of mechanisms the Romans understood with the precision of men who used the tool often. Cicero would call it crudelissimum taeterimumque supplicium, the cruelest and most disgusting punishment. In his prosecution of Verus a few years later, he was not making a moral argument. He was noting an operational specification. The position forced the arms wide and overhead, transferring the body's weight to the wrists and shoulders in a way that locked the chest in partial inhalation. To exhale, the condemned man had to push up against the nail through his feet, lifting his weight off his diaphragm long enough to release a breath. He then sagged back onto his wrists, and the cycle began again. He breathed by pressing repeatedly against his own mutilation. When the legs gave out, from exhaustion, from blood loss, from muscle failure under sustained anaerobic load, the breathing stopped. The process could last hours. It could last days. Roman executioners sometimes broke the legs with an iron bar, the cruri fragium, when speed was wanted. Crassus did not give that order. The men on the crosses along the Via Appia were left to find their own pace toward the end. Crows worked the line during the day. The smell concentrated around each upright as the first week passed. Travelers on the road covered their faces with cloth. The sounds, in the early hours, were what you would expect. Calls for water, names of mothers, prayers in Thracian and Gallic and Celtic, and a dozen other languages that had reached Italy in the holds of slave ships. The progressive silence that replaced those sounds across the following weeks was Crassus's actual finished work. He did not order the bodies cut down. They were left in place until weather and birds and time reduced them. The audience was not Spartacus, who was already dead and already unidentifiable. The audience was every slave in Italy who had spent the last 3 years thinking the unthinkable thought. Every man bent over a millstone in a Campanian farmstead who had asked himself, in the privacy of his own skull, whether what Spartacus had done could be done again. Every household slave in Rome who served wine in a senator's triclinium and listened, every shepherd in the Lucanian highlands whose grandfather had served in the army of Eunice or Athenion in the previous century's Sicilian risings. Crassus was sealing that thought back into silence at the rate of one body every 33 meters of pavement. The financial logic was, as always with him, intact. The cost of 6,000 crosses, the timber, the nails, the labor of the work parties, was a rounding error against the cost of 3 years of war and the wreck of southern Italian agriculture. The return on the investment was the prevention of the next rebellion. He was performing an economic analysis on social terror, and he was investing accordingly. The next major slave revolt in Italy would not come for over 400 years. The investment paid out across the entire imperial period. Then Pompey arrived. He came down from the north with his Spanish veterans, having received Senate orders to descend on the war. He found the main battle finished, and Crassus already at work on the road. Pompey was not a man who accepted the situation he found. He was a man who edited the situation until it suited him. His advance guard encountered a band of roughly 5,000 rebels who had escaped the breakup at the Silurus. Men running north into Etruria, no longer part of Spartacus's core force, no longer organized in any meaningful sense. Pompey's legions ran them down in open country and killed all of them. Then he sat down in his command tent and wrote a letter to the Senate. Plutarch preserves the substance of the letter in the Life of Pompey, chapter 21, and the Life of Crassus, chapter 11. The composition was a masterpiece of political language. It congratulated Crassus on his victory in the field, which was gracious and accurate. It then noted, with the smoothness of a man who understood the messaging environment of Rome as well as any politician of his generation, that Crassus had defeated the slaves in pitched battle, but that he, Pompey, had pulled the war up by its roots. Stirpitus, by the roots. The verb mattered. It implied that what Crassus had done was incomplete, that the work had needed a finisher, that without Pompey, the rebellion would have regrown. Technically true in the most narrow sense, comprehensively dishonest in every sense that mattered. He had killed exhausted stragglers from somebody else's battle and presented this to the Senate as the closing chapter of the conflict. The Senate read both dispatches in the same week and granted both men honors. The legal threshold for a full triumphus, the chariot procession up the sacred way to the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus on the Capitoline, required a war against a recognized foreign enemy with a specified body count of enemy soldiers killed in formal battle. The threshold was 5,000 enemy dead in a single engagement, certified by the commander on his honor. A slave revolt did not legally qualify. The men who fought against Rome under Spartacus had been classed as res property throughout the war. You could not, in the strictest reading of ius triumphal, triumph over property. Pompey received a full triumph anyway. The Senate folded his Spartacus contribution into the existing glory of his Spanish campaign, where he had been confirmed imperator in the field after the defeat of Sertorius's remnants. He rode through Rome on the 29th of December, 71 BC, in a chariot drawn by 4 white horses. His face was painted with the red lead of Jupiter, the minium that linked him for one day to the god whose temple stood at the procession's end. The slave behind him in the chariot whispered the ritual phrase, "Respice post te, hominem te memento." Look behind you. Remember you are a man. Crassus received an ovatio, the lesser honor. He entered the city on foot, wearing a wreath of myrtle rather than laurel, accompanied not by trumpets, but by flutes. Suetonius, writing a century and a half later, would note that Crassus afterward petitioned the Senate to permit him to wear the laurel wreath of the full triumph at his ovation, and the Senate granted the petition as a face-saving compromise. A laurel crown on a flute procession. He had funded the war from his own treasury. He had built the wall across Brutium. He had decimated Roman citizens to put steel back into broken cohorts. He had hunted Spartacus through the Lucanian highlands and forced the decision on the Silurus. He had hung 6,000 men along 200 kilometers of road. His reward was a flute and a borrowed laurel. The Senate gave Pompey the chariot. The Senate gave Crassus the bill. The bitter arithmetic of that outcome was not historical accident. It was the natural product of two different categories of power meeting inside the political machinery of the late Republic. Crassus had money. Pompey had something Rome valued more: the affection of the urban crowd, the cumulative prestige of a commander who had been handed difficult assignments and had always returned with a victory, and the political fluency to ensure his victories were always narrated by him first. Plutarch records that the young Marcus Cato, who had served as a tribune in the war, refused the military decorations Crassus offered him afterward, on the grounds that the war had not been one Rome should remember with pride. Cato would later be the loudest senatorial voice against both Crassus and Pompey, but the gesture in 71 BC marked the beginning of his public career. Crassus stood in Rome after the ovation and counted what his investment had returned. He had spent perhaps a fifth of his fortune on the war. He had committed the political crime of decimation and absorbed the cost. He had engineered a military operation without precedent in the Republic's history. He had killed the most dangerous enemy Italy had faced since Hannibal had withdrawn from the peninsula 131 years earlier. And a man who had been in Spain for the previous 5 years had written a letter that the Senate had found more persuasive than his entire campaign. He filed it. Crassus was a patient man. Patience was the substance from which he had built everything he owned. He and Pompey were elected consuls together for 70 BC, holding the office in a shared coldness that nobody mistook for friendship. They quarreled openly in the Senate. They reconciled publicly on the last day of their consulship, with Crassus offering his hand on the rostra, in a piece of political theater that fooled no one in Rome but reassured the markets. He would form an alliance in 60 BC with Julius Caesar and with Pompey, 3 men holding the Republic in a private grip. The arrangement later historians would name the First Triumvirate. Through it, he would secure the consulship a second time, in 55 BC, with Pompey again as colleague. Through it, he would finally win the military command he still wanted, the proconsulship of Syria, the chance to march east against the Parthian Empire and bring home the kind of triumph the Senate could not deny him. He marched in 53 BC at the head of 7 legions, roughly 35,000 infantry and 4,000 cavalry. He crossed the Euphrates against the advice of his officers and of the Armenian king Artavasdes, who had urged him to take the northern route through the highlands where the Parthian cavalry could not maneuver. The Parthian general Surena, of the great house of Suren and only 30 years old, waited for him on the open plains of Mesopotamia, near a town called Karhay in what is now southeastern Turkey, with 1,000 cataphracts in scale armor and 9,000 horse archers and a baggage train of arrows that did not run out when Crassus expected it would. The Romans formed the testudo, the tortoise formation, shields locked overhead. The Parthian arrows fell on them for hours. The testudo turned out not to be designed for prolonged archery. Arrows found gaps. Men were pinned through the shield to the arm beneath it, unable to lower their guard without exposing the next man. Crassus's son Publius, who had brought a cavalry unit of Gauls from Caesar's service to join his father's army, led a counterattack to break the encirclement. He was cut off. His head was brought back to the Roman line on the point of a spear and shown to his father across the field. Crassus held the line until nightfall, then attempted a retreat that broke apart in the dark. He died the next day in a parley that turned into a brawl, killed by a Parthian officer named Pomaxathres. One tradition preserved by Cassius Dio holds that the Parthians poured molten gold into his dead mouth. Here is the wealth you wanted. Take as much as you can hold. His head was sent to the Parthian king Orodes II, who was attending a wedding banquet at which a Greek actor was performing scenes from Euripides's Bacchae. The actor took Crassus's head from the messenger and used it as the head of Pentheus in the play's final scene, holding it up before the assembled court. The richest man in Rome ended his career as a stage prop in a Greek tragedy. The Appian Way outlasted him. The crosses were gone by then. Wood rots, bodies fall. The road needed clearing for traffic regardless of what had been attached to its verges. But the road itself endured, paved with the same basalt stones that had carried the slow procession of the dying in 71 BC. Sections of those stones are still in place today, between Rome and Brindisi, walked by pilgrims and tourists who mostly do not know what they are walking past. Every Roman who traveled it in the generations after carried some version of the knowledge of what had happened there. The story entered the Republic's collective memory not as a story of liberation, but as a cautionary account of the cost of disorder, which was exactly how Crassus had intended it to be read. He had suppressed a rebellion and authored its meaning in the same operation. Whether the men on those crosses would have recognized the story being told about them is a question history cannot answer. What we know is that they existed, that they fought, that for 3 years they had taken the most powerful military republic in the Western world and forced it to look into a mirror it preferred not to look into. The gap between the civilization Rome claimed to embody and the slavery on which that civilization actually ran. They lost, but the fact that 6,000 of them had to be hung along 200 kilometers of road to make the point about losing is itself a measurement. You do not build that monument for an enemy who was not dangerous. You build it because you were afraid. Crassus was afraid of Spartacus. He solved the problem of his fear with engineering, with silver, and with the cold willingness to hurt people on a scale that made other men look away. He won. The Senate cheated him of the full recognition. He died in a desert 18 years later, chasing the glory Rome had refused to grant him at home, and his head was used as a theater prop in front of a king who had never seen him alive. And the man whose body he could never find on the field at the Silarus remained nameless and graveless, and for exactly that reason remained, in the imagination of every age that came after, somehow larger than the man who killed him. That is the final account of the Third Servile War. It balances differently depending on which column you read. If this story held you all the way to here, do one thing before you go. Hit subscribe if you have not already. Drop a like. Send it to someone who needs to see what Rome actually was underneath the marble and the speeches. You stayed for a story most people will not even start, and that matters. You have just watched another premium documentary from Romanus, your home of the Roman Empire on YouTube. Now, look at the video on your screen. Click it. The descent into the past does not end here.